This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit Podcast. I'm Kay Savitz. Tim Boehlert began at Atari in 1982. He worked at WCI Labs, the New York Atari subsidiary, where he worked on the breadboard of the 600XL, robotics projects, and mass storage devices. This interview took place on June 4th, 2022.
Well, I grew up in central New York. Early 70s, I was playing music for not a living, but that was my goal, was to make it in the music industry. About 1980 or so, a group of us that were playing together decided to move to New York, kind of as a family, which was kind of nice, made it a lot easier. And so 4 of us moved down in 1981, I believe. And I believe it was probably a couple of weeks before I ended up landing a job. My first job was at Sam Goody's, and that lasted maybe about 6 months or so. Ended up going to work for Warner Brothers. They have a division called WEA, W-E-A, which stands for Warner Electra Atlantic. And they were the record distribution arm for those 3 labels. So I started out there in the mail room. And by the summer of '82, there was a kind of a lull in the industry, a major dip, and I got laid off. I had moved up from mailroom to inventory clerk. So I would literally walk the island to all the venues. I'd start down World Trade Center. I think it was J&K Music I went to first. And I would walk my way back uptown. I had to count certain records and inventory that for the sales guys. Let's see. So summer of '82, I got chopped from that job, laid off as a result of the slump. And the one great thing about the Warner umbrella was that they would find you other employment. I was offered 2 positions, and I had my choice. First position was for a new startup company that worked in the video industry, MTV. The other one was for Atari, and I tend to sway towards the technology end, so that's where I went. I went to Atari. And that was really, really interesting. Again, I started in the mailroom. When I was interviewed by, I know after the fact that I guess he was like the lead engineer there. His name was Bob Card. And the reason I got the job was because Bob was a frustrated musician as well. So once he found out I played music, my foot was in the door as far as he was concerned. He convinced the human resources department to hire me on. And I believe at that time it was a young lady named Penny Yang. And they were great people. They were just very nice out of the box. You know, growing up where I grew up in a small town, the big city was a big deal for me. And, you know, we up here hear stories about, you know, how rude New Yorkers are and et cetera, et cetera. You get used to it after a while. It's, you know, I think it's a persona that they put on to defend themselves. But these guys were great. You know, I know Penny, I think, lived out on the island. Bob lived right on the island of Manhattan with me. I think he was maybe in the lower 60s. I was in the lower 90s, Upper West Side. So that started it. I basically worked in the mailroom for, you know, a very short period of time, and because the company was expanding so quickly, he pushed me into the tech position. And that starts the whole story of working on the 600 XL and doing the robotics projects, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not really sure how much you know about my history there, or what you'd like to talk about, because it's kind of expansive. I've actually learned a lot of new things by listening to podcasts, um, hearing some of the old voices that, of people that I actually worked with. Was really nice to see that and hear that. And my interest in Atari got renewed by a gentleman named Kurt Vendel, who had reached out to me, a handful of years ago before he passed away. And we had some great discussions. I had no idea that people were still interested, that there's people out there that are, collectors, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of came as a revelation to me, because, basically when I moved out of there, probably like 84, 85, I moved back upstate. I did some technician work. As a result, I worked for a small Apple dealer up here. And then I moved back to New Jersey, mid 80s, probably 86 maybe. And I ended up working for one of the gentlemen that was my boss when I worked at Atari. He was actually the same guy that had to, tell me the bad news. Oh, well, sorry, we got to let you go. So, and his name is Gary Schober. Gary's a great guy. He's got a great family. They treated me like family when I got back down to New Jersey. They watched out for me, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm very indebted to him and his wife and their kids. And as it turns out now, the company that I worked for was Berkeley Veritronics. And we worked out of a small building in Piscataway, and I did technician work. And Gary has just got this amazing mind, several patents to his name for electronics, security electronics. We worked on a lot of great projects that, may have affected, where we are in the world today with that stuff. But I didn't really know him that well when I worked at Atari, because he was more of a manager, above my pay grade, obviously. And I think he managed the office for a while he was there. And I believe he was right there to the end with Steve. So
I believe you started at Atari at about July 1982, more or less. When about did you leave? Were you there for the transition to the Jack Tramiel?
I don't believe I was.
Okay, so that was July 84 when they took over.
I knew the names. And so maybe it was 84 when I left. Maybe springtime, summer. I'm not really sure. I mean, I've got some, cards and things that, like I've got, there's my Atari medical card.
Nice.
And this is I think these are all Atari cards. So basically they issued us to us. I don't know if it was every quarter, but we had to sign them and keep them for, I think it was for anything medical that we had to deal with.
It's amazing. You kept all that stuff. That's neat.
Well, I'm a collector. This is my first WIA assignment. That's actually my Atari business card. And this is my WCI Labs business card.
Nice.
And I think this is another WCI Labs, actually a photo ID.
So officially you were an employee of WCI Labs, which was... Well,
officially I was working for WIA first, which is Warner Electro Atlantic. And then I worked for Atari Inc. And then Steve made a deal with Steve Ross, I believe, to transition to WCI Labs. So we still worked for Atari, but we were treated as a separate entity. Again, things get into a lot of politics, a lot of things that I had no idea about at the time. I've actually been pretty educated with Kurt's book And like I said, some of the podcasts that I've heard, yours specifically, I picked up on a name that I had forgotten about. I was like, yeah, I remember that guy. Don't remember real well, but I remember the name. And so this past year, I really spent some time calling my notes together, to try to piece together who these people were, and talking to Kurt. I mean, Kurt was a godsend for me in that respect, because he really helped me remember things that I'd forgotten about, projects, people. We talked about, how he got into it, and ultimately it ended up turning out that he was a dumpster diver.
Yeah, yeah.
And I didn't know that. I found it humorous, but at the same time, it was like brilliant. What he did was brilliant. He went out and he actually saved a lot of history.
Yeah, he did.
People got to see. I've never been to the museum. That was part of the goal. Was he was actually going to come to my house up here in Syracuse, and we were going to sit down and chit chat, compare notes. I was going to show him my 600, and the revelation I got from him was that he had the second one I built. When I was at WCI Labs Atari, we built two of those.
Prototype 600 XLs.
The 600 XL,
Mhm.
yeah. I actually breadboarded both of those and worked with Bob and Glenn Bowles and Phil DeRue, were my three primary engineers. And they would give me fixes, and they'd be in their office doing their thing. I'd be breadboarding the fixes, cutting traces, doing jumpers. It was a mess, but that's usually how those things start out. They start out with a great idea. They get some pre-PCB designs done. I remember that they had, I think, about 10 boards that were sent to us, and they had to each be numbered, and they had to be accounted for, and you had to sign off on these things. And I remember starting them, and it probably took months to get it all together to where we could say, okay, let's send this to Sunnyvale and let's see, what their feedback is. Now, the dynamic at that time was always that there was always a rub between New York and California. I don't know if it was one-upmanship or what it was, but it obviously caused some angst for everybody involved. Luckily, I wasn't really involved with all of that, other than that I knew that there was, some, I don't want to say animosity. It was, maybe ego. They want to come up with the ideas, and we're not good enough because we're not corporate Sunnyvale. So, but yeah, it was a really interesting dynamic, and eventually, like I said, I got the first one done, and we kept that one in our lab, and then I duplicated that. We did a second one. I sent that to California, and as far as I know, it disappeared off the face of the earth until I talked to Kurt, and Kurt was like, "Well, I got something I want to share with you." And that share was that he actually had that second one. I've never been able to verify it because we never got together. But the one thing he did tell me was that his didn't work. I said, "Well, Kurt, I got you. Mine still works. I haven't checked it in 30 years or so, but I said I had the working prototype." And my thought was, Bob gave it to me, and that was a great gesture. I wanted to give it back to Bob. Unfortunately, Bob passed away, and I didn't know about it. I found out from Steve. I'd been able to contact Steve and found out that he passed away. Bob was married, but he never had kids. So, I kept it for 40 plus years now. And, I've just recently gotten rid of it. I had to, make bills basically, and I had to let it go, which is a shame. But I did try to sell it locally to a a museum out in Rochester.
The Strom?
Yes, the
Hmm.
Strong Museum. I approached them, and unfortunately, we couldn't agree on terms. I had a more substantial offer from a collector internationally, and he's now in possession of a lot of my collection from that time. And my hope is that he'll do the right thing and get it out there so people can enjoy what that is for what it is. Because I don't think a lot of people really understood, the significance of that computer, and what it means in terms of the evolution of the industry, the evolution of the Atari specifically. I mean,
Well, let's
those
talk
were,
about that. What do you think that computer meant in the big picture of the evolution of Atari?
well, it was downsizing. The what do you got there? An 800 behind you there. So it
Yeah.
was half the size of that.
Yeah.
It had, I think it had 64K RAM on board, plus a slot, plus the external slots on the backside. It had basic on board for the first time, and that was a huge deal. I didn't, I mean, I didn't realize the significance, and like I said, until I've really revised the history and looked back on like Kurt's book specifically, to see things that like he was able to piece together things that I didn't know about, that were going on in California. So, hearing about the difference with the Tremels and whatnot, their design ideas and everything. Everything was always about bottom dollar, which, for me as a technician, I could care less.
Right.
I felt bad for the engineers because they really had to dumb down things to make it worth, 3 cents in Taiwan to put this together or whatever it was. Never really understood that, never appreciated it. I do, and I understand better now as I'm older. But I was 20, 27, 28 years old. I was new to the business world. I worked mostly retail and things before that. So for me, it was an exciting time, a great learning time. I had some of the smartest people in the world around me, at least in my world. Like Steve was just amazing. Steve Mayer. He always shocked me and surprised me with how deep he was, but humble, and he and his wife Nancy were such nice people. Again, I got treated like family with them as well. So, sometimes that would be Steve's personal chauffeur and take him to different business meetings and things like that. Um, but yeah, the 600 XL compact size, the amount of firepower on board was unprecedented at that time. And I think that was also the beginning of when they started talking about doing business things with this, as a machine. I mean, we had development tools around us that were like PDP 11s and things like that, fax machines that, you know, way over my head, but I understood how that worked. But I also got to see how long it would take for, one of the game programmers to program a certain animation sequence. Could take hours for the computer to crunch it all down to get it to the state where we could put it on a ROM, put it in a cart, and we could play it at home. So
Yeah. So how long did it take to get that prototype 600 XL to work? You said months?
probably a couple months. Yeah,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't have a timeline on it. I kept a lot of the paperwork. Bob had given me, personal notes on it, some PCB changes. Every time they'd find a problem, I'd correct it based on what they found. We'd try it again, test it. And, obviously it was for the evolution of getting the PC board right first. before we shipped it off. But I mean, those first two prototypes were just full of wires. And I can send you all the pictures and stuff I've got. So if you need that, just let me know. Because
Yes,
like I said,
please. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I've got a lot of those things. I've got, well, I had the schematic with each of the chips. And again, this year I went back and started trying to locate, okay, this is the Antic chip, this is the GTIA, things like that. So
I
like
saw
I said,
on your Facebook you had posted photo of the cover of your engineering notebook.
yeah, I've got those.
Have you scanned that?
I've
'Cause-
probably taken pictures. Here's one,
nice. Uh-huh.
and that's yeah, that's the Atari. So that's the first one I got, probably, I'm guessing 82.
Mm-hmm.
And then this is the WCI conversion.
Nice.
And I mean, for me, they're both mostly empty, because I really didn't do the type of stuff that these were meant for. These were really meant more for, yeah. So this says 103183,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the WCI one. And Gary actually had to sign off on it. So we were given these, even the techs were given these to write down things, anything that you thought of or thought was important, you were supposed to write down in these books. I was a busy guy, and that really wasn't my realm. I was like, well, I didn't design anything there. I didn't come up with any ideas for anything there. So the book was their legal way of capturing the technology. Everybody had to sign the book. You had to hand that in, if and when you left. It was the property of Warner Communications at that time. So,
Mm-hmm. Do you remember what it felt like when you saw that machine turn on for the first time?
yeah, I kind of do, because when I started there, I think the first thing that they gave me to play with, and literally that's what they wanted me to do, was the 400. And I think at the time, I think that the largest ROM was 4K. And I mean, for somebody that came from the Hicks and is now playing with this Wonder Machine, it was pretty fascinating. As basic as these things were then, 4K was a lot of memory. It was like, wow. And then you could expand up to, I think, maybe up to 16K or something like that. It was like, who could afford that? I know the stuff was expensive. Obviously, we had hands-on to pretty much anything we wanted at that point. The checkbook was open, I believe. So you got to take one home. And, you had one at work that you could work on. And they would give me, little things to, I think it was more really to help me understand the technology. So they'd give me, oh, hey, why don't you, let's see here, I got one of these books. Why don't you learn a basic? So, this is the manual that came in the book.
Yep, Inside
And
Atari Basic. Sure.
yeah, and I remember when this book came out, I was like, oh my God, I gotta have that book.
Mm-hmm.
And you spent literally hours taking the programs out of this, typing them in, saving them to a cassette deck. And that was always the hard part. I was like, oh geez, something happened. But yeah, turning the machine that I actually built together with Bob and Phil and Glenn was pretty awesome to see it come up, see basic come up, see the prompt there, and try some programming on it, make sure that the ports were working, joysticks and all of that stuff. It was very heady stuff, but like I said, I'm very white neophyte in that whole realm of what's going on. I was like, wow, that's amazing. How did you guys do that? And I remember very specifically sitting in Bob's office with the three engineers, and they would have these graphs and charts and things up on the wall. And I remember Glenn explaining to me at one point how RAS and CAS worked okay, what is RAS and CAS and what does that mean? And they had timing diagrams that they were trying to get this thing to work in a specific sequence of command orders to get each chip to talk to each other in, milliseconds or whatever it ended up being. But it was just amazing that they could think of that on that level. And for me, it was, hey, this is a great toy. I can get to play this game finally.
Right.
So just two totally different worlds, but I got an appreciation for what they do and how they did it and how dedicated they were. They were just pretty amazing at that stuff.
I've seen you mention some online, some other projects that you worked on at your time at Atari. I have a list. I don't know the order they came in. I don't know how much you worked on them or how important, but you had mentioned the Atari telephone. You had mentioned robotics. You had mentioned video disc devices. Maybe you worked with the Alien Group, Mike Matthews. I want to know about all those things.
Mike Matthews, I don't know that I had anything to do with that. I know at some point I had one of the boxes that Mike had designed and I gave it to my brother. I would take a lot of the things that I had access to, that were ended up being my property. I gave all of that or most of my collection to my older brother, because he had taken an interest in it when, my interest waned and I was outside of Atari at that time. But I know he's got the Mike Matthews box. The robotics project I worked on, I actually built 2 or 3 different robots for them. The laser disc thing was, I believe the guy's name was Marty Perlmutter. Marty ended up being a resident in my brownstone, Upper West Side. I think he was on the top floor. And oddly, we met through Atari. And that was about basically storage, using these things for storage, but for gaming. I'm not sure what the other projects were at the time, but I remember, they were like 12-inch platters and very, very expensive. Everything was very, very expensive back then. Even, 300 baud modems were expensive. I think at the time I was in just a brownstone, 1 bedroom or no bedroom, like a split level. I think I was paying like $1,000 a month for rent. So, so if you're paying $200 for something, that's a good chunk out of your paycheck.
Yeah.
But let's see. So the robotics projects, this is probably close to the blooming point of Atari WCI Labs. We had a lot of people there. I believe we occupied 2 floors on West 42nd Street or East 42nd. I'm sorry. It was 42nd and 2nd Ave. And we had 2 floors and certain people were on the 1 floor. You've talked to Greg Squires, right?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Okay. So Greg, I think even in his mention on your podcast, I believe he was on the upper floor, and I think it was maybe 6 and 10 we were on. So he had one group of guys, and then most of the guys I worked with were on the other floor. And I believe Steve and Nancy were on that floor. The engineers, Gary was on that floor. Greg was on that floor for a short period of time. And then we had in the back corner, we had a large lab that I started out, I was the only technician, and then we hired this guy, Steve Alpert, I think was in there. There was another gentleman named Mickey, and I don't know his last name. But as like the things that you guys offer, it's really spurred me on to start to try to piece some of this together. Because I think it is important, very specifically for the people that want to understand more about everything that went on at Atari. Not a lot of people know about the difference between Atari and WCI Labs, and what we did in New York is a really small portion of the overall picture of the Atari structure, but it's a really important part.
Yeah, Atari, I mean, really for a minute, invested a lot into R&D and trying to, in different various labs, and trying to create things in Grass Valley and Sunnyvale and
Yeah.
you guys. And yeah, they worked on some amazing projects that some came to be and some didn't. So
Well, yeah, I mean, like the Atari Tel, it's funny because since moving to Syracuse, it had to be early 90s. I saw it in an AT&T store, and I was blown away. Like, wow, that's what we worked on.
picture phone, yeah.
Yeah, and it was, and my wife at the time, I was like, you can't believe how this is affecting me right at the moment, seeing this thing sitting there in Syracuse, New York. I remember, I don't remember much about the project itself. I remember taking it to a meeting for Steve or with Steve someplace in Midtown. I know that Steve and I went out to AT&T at some point, Bell Labs in Jersey. And the reason I remember that was because I was his chauffeur that day. And I think they had like a Mercedes. I'd never been in a Mercedes in my life. And I remember being on, I think it was the Jersey Turnpike. And I passed a cop on my left-hand side. I was in the passing lane. And I'm like, yeah, not to worry about. Then I looked down at the speedometer. I was doing like 90 miles an hour. I was shocked. I was like, wow. And he didn't stop me. But that's what I remember, things like that. But yeah, I remember taking them there, and I remember my other association with AT&T was learning about the C language, and I don't know if they had C++ out at the time, but getting a book by the guy that wrote the C language and looking at some of those things. Like I said, I was kind of on the periphery of learning and being mentored along that curve, and it was a really, really steep curve. The programming guys that we had were just amazing to watch them work. Yeah, I mean, it was a great atmosphere, but they worked their asses off. They really worked hard to get, like I said, simple animation working. And they would explain to me about sprites. Was the first time I'd heard that term. And Bob would teach me about the refresh rate on the video, and how they would use the time in between bottom of the screen and the upper top left hand corner for that refresh, how they could use the time for that to do things in the background and then reintroduce the animation. So yeah, I mean, I learned a lot of information that's useless to me today, but it's nice to know that, yeah, okay, yeah, I remember that. Yeah, once somebody starts talking about it, it gets me on a roll. So but yeah, the robotics, basically we started out with kits. We bought kits probably like everybody else.
A Keith kit and that sort of thing.
The what? I'm sorry?
Like Keith kit robots and that sort of thing.
Yes, yeah. Heathkit was one of them. The other one I found, and I think I posted it on one of there were two forums online that I frequented last year or earlier this year. And I would find clues about some of the robotics. Like, this is a piece from one of the robots that we worked on.
Looking at a little glass or plastic cube about an inch on each side, maybe with some sort of logo on it that I don't recognize.
Yeah, that was the logo for the, I don't know if it was Armatron or something like that. I've got all the information, and I can, like I said, I'll share all of that. I shared a lot of this already on those two forums in long threads, and I hopefully I saved all of that. But that was probably like a $2,000 robot at the time, and it was just a simple arm. And I don't mean to denigrate it by saying simple, but in today's terms, it was very, very, very simple. And it had, I think it had an RS-232 interface that we could hook up to a computer, and, with the right programming, you could make it grab something, which was amazing. Pick it up, move it, release it. That was it. But that was a major at that time frame. I mean, just, especially in the, I guess, the educational and commercial market, these things were being used in industry or just being developed for industry. Therefore, they were very, very expensive. So the first one that we got that was of that nature was like a crane arm with a gripper, and it was basically just a PC board that you populated with the chips that they gave you, and chip carriers, and soldered it all together. And it probably had just, a very basic interface, probably the smaller D sub RS-232 connector that went to the Atari, I believe. And I had to learn the fourth programming language. Again, it was just like, okay, Tim, just take this and do what you can, and let's get it up and running. So, so I'd spend a lot of time, on and off the clock, trying to get this thing going. Because I mean, I knew it was important to them. I knew it was a big deal. And I was now getting very, very hungry for the knowledge, and wanting to learn this stuff and be helpful. So I would, I do things on my own time, which, I mean, that's just part of my traits. I do that all the time still now. My wife hates me for it sometimes, but she can't beat it out of me. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I did that first one. I think I know I did a Heathkit one, and that was, I don't know, like a R2D2 type of a thing. It had wheels on it. It had an arm on it. I think it had a top turret that moved. It had some sensors, radar type sensors that would be for proximity to walls, and it was really the beginning of all that technology that's on. What are these little Zoom bots or whatever they have that sweep the floor? That's really what that was all about. Was really that the first part of that technology. And then what are we, 40 years on, and now it's a commercial home product.
Sure.
So, and I guess they go errant sometimes and run after the cat and whatnot, but
Did you work on any other projects that we haven't talked about?
Well, there was a guy there named Sandy. I don't know if I've got his name or not, but Sandy was another level of engineer, and Sandy was there working on laser projects. I don't know what they ever ended up doing that, but we had this laser table that came in, and it was all steel construction, and it had pre-threaded holes in the entire top. I'm guessing it was like a 4x8 sheet of plywood. So all the screw holes were to keep everything locked down in precise spots. And I don't know what you remember about lasers of that time, but basically the laser was a very dangerous item. You had to wear special glasses. You had to be extremely careful. For them to get it to split to color ranges, they use prisms to split off the the RGB aspects, whatever it ended up being. And I remember, oddly enough, in this building that we were in, this thing was so large and so heavy, they actually had to put it on top of the elevator to get it to the floor. So they had to hire an outside firm specifically to get it into the elevator shaft, put it on top of the elevator, bring it up to 6 or 10, and offload it from there and get it into the room. I mean, this was not something that 10 guys could just stand around and pick it up and move it. But once it was in place, that was the purpose of the weight was to keep it as concrete as possible, no vibrations, et cetera, et cetera. All I recall of that is it was in a room. I remember, Sandy would spend hours and days putting all the little bits and pieces together, clamping everything down, and then finally turning on the laser for the first time to get some result. I have no idea what they used it for, though. I don't recall much of that because, like I said, I was available to all of these guys for things that they needed, including, running out to the photo store to buy this or, buy that. I did a lot of that, gopher type thing. But yeah, there was stuff going on around me that I didn't know about, like talking back to Greg Squires again. I know he had projects going on that I wasn't really involved with too much, maybe here or there, I was a cursory part of getting something for them or maybe breadboarding something. I'm sure I did a bunch of that stuff. I just don't recall specifics for his thing. Like I said, my biggest and fondest memory was working with Bob and Phil and Glenn, Glenn and Phil, I ended up working for in New Jersey with Gary. He hired on, the guys that he worked with in New York when he started his own business over in Jersey. So I got to work with them for a good couple of years. And oddly enough, Glenn's son was on one of the forums and I saw the last name and I reached out to him. I said, well, was your dad's name Glenn? And yeah, it was. I said, well, I worked with your dad. And, that was very, very interesting because, I'm sure I knew about Glenn having children, but, they were probably 2-3 years old, maybe at that time. But we worked together to piece out the fact that, somebody had an 800 that said WCI Labs was stenciled on it. And I don't ever remember seeing that ever. So maybe that was after my time there, but he verified that, yeah, my dad's got one or I've got dad's and it had that stencil on it. So Steve Alpert he was like my buddy there and he was, I think a Queens guy, but he was another amazing kid. I mean, he outshined me in so many ways doing the tech stuff because that was his background. That wasn't mine. I did it for guitar electronics and my dad worked for Western Electric. So I had that stuff around me all the time. I learned how to solder and put things together, not necessarily breadboarding computers, obviously, but it's all related. And once you get really good at soldering, everything else is easy. I don't have to understand the technology. All I have to do is read either the engineer's notes or a schematic to figure out, okay, point A to point B, okay, solder those 2 points, put a jumper, cut it, whatever you do. So, but Steve, not the sidetrack, but Steve kind of mentored me as well. And he had a brilliant mind. He was a programmer and he loved his gaming stuff. But he was also an engineer of sorts and a great technician. He's the first guy that taught me about pirating. He knew how to take the disk drives and put a switch on them to make them, do whatever they had to do to bypass whatever the latest technology was to stop you from copying a disk. He's the one that showed me how to punch the side of a disk, with the cutters, that type of stuff. But yeah, I mean, he was a great kid. His wife was also named Nancy. And I mean, he always had the greatest new software. Oh yeah, here, you want to copy this, try this, and let's see if this works. And he would breadboard some stuff like that and figure out how to get around these things so that we could get the most use out of, you'd take a single-sided floppy, cut it, flip it over. Now you've got a double-sided floppy. Learned a lot of stuff from him on that respect. It was useful, for us at the time. It was, like I said, you didn't think about the legal aspects. You just thought about the fun. It's like, oh yeah, we can do this. Oh yeah, nobody knows this, but here's the idea. Here's how you do this. And so, like I said, I learned a lot of technology through those channels which were obviously not corporate endorsed, but that's how we learned. I mean, and
Yeah.
everybody at Atari was kind of like that. It was like, it's not about stealing anything. It's about learning how things work. Okay, a floppy disk has this ability. Why don't they use the second side? Well, because maybe there's some flaws on it. Therefore, you get the one side to write on, the other side, they can't guarantee. Who cares? 27 years old. Who cares about that? Just give me the disk. Let me have twice the storage power that I didn't have, and I'll take my chances with it. So yeah, pretty cool stuff. We all were looking at each other's products. I remember Commodore 64 coming out. I remember the VIC 20. I remember the first IBM PC coming out. And we looked at all of that technology. It was important because it's like, well, you got to see what your neighbor's doing and how does that work. At Atari, we had a guy named Jim Hannon that I don't know what his role was, if he was a financial guy or, some behind the scenes administrator, but I remember the mindset. Do you remember that computer?
Yeah. Some of
Okay.
the Atari alums went and created the Mindset Corporation, and yeah.
So somehow we were involved with it. I remember that being in our office. Jim was there. Jim was an employee. But again, he was kind of out of my realm of, he was on that end of the hall with Steve and a guy named Jeff Frankel, I think Jeff was a finance guy for us. And then I think Jim came later on, but the mindset was a whole new thing. I remember them talking, I don't know, maybe this is a bad memory, but I remember something about maybe the next computer, I'm not sure. But there were things like that floating around our office all the time. And yeah, sometimes you'd see it. I had no interest in things that weren't Atari at that time. I was like, yeah, whatever. That's, I wasn't a business guy. So I was like, hey, if it has nothing to do with gaming, I don't care about it. But like I said, there were some other great things like the robotics. We had a division of guys that worked for Nancy that were developing toys for kids. That was really interesting. I can't remember the kid's name or gentleman's name. I think it was Gary something. But he was, very vibrant. He was really big into that toy industry. He knew about that stuff. And he had a group of people around him. So I've been able to find, names that I could associate with that. Walt was another guy that worked there. Walt was kind of more like a business guy, but he was a programmer. So, you had guys like me that would come in a t-shirt and jeans, and you had guys that came in suits every day. It was just a very, very interesting, eclectic mix of people that worked there. So, yeah, like I said, it was a really interesting atmosphere because you got to have fun at work. You didn't have, you had pressure, but not like we experience today. You went in, yeah, you had some things to do today, but nobody was standing over you. It was really more of a pride thing and maybe an ego thing to get that done quickly and efficiently.
What do you do with yourself these days?
Well, right now I'm a security professional. Probably from 86 on, I was somewhat in the computer industry. I did desktop publishing. I got good at that. Did that for a number of years. I learned how to use Photoshop. I did a lot of film output for print. So I got to learn about the printing industry and what their needs were. I was a stagehand for 10 years. So I worked at a local casino, moving boxes, setting up, tearing down shows for 10 years out in Verona, New York, a place called Turning Stone Casino. And then after that, I did security. I got in my first job at security was at a local hospital. I'm not a religious guy, but I've always felt that I was put in places that I could do something, maybe contribute to, hopefully. Atari would have been one of those places. Like I have no idea how I ended up there. It was just, I liked music. I ended up doing computers. From computers, I ended up doing, more music again. So maybe it's in cycles. Now I'm back in the security field. and I'm working hotel security, which is something new for me.
If you could send a message to the people who are still using their Atari computers today,
Mhm.
and you can right now,
Yeah.
what would you tell them?
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, it does. It means a lot to those of us that work there. At least to me, it does. Like I said, I had no idea anybody had any interest in Atari. Any of the stuff we've tried to talk about today. Um, yeah, it's important. It is a piece of history that has framed us where we are today, including the Macintosh. I mean, Alan Kay came to our facility. Alan Kay brought in the Apple Lisa to us to
Mm.
play with and check out. That was $10,000 at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and I got hands on with that. Alan Kay brought to us the idea of the mouse. He got it from Xerox Alto Park, which is where he worked. He explained what it was, and we kind of looked at each other like, okay, how's that going to work? Um, he probably brought touchscreen technology to us. He probably brought that idea, because I remember talking about that. I said, well, how do you touch the screen and the cursor? How does that work? Capacitance. What's that? You know what I'm saying? It's
Yeah.
things like that. It's like I've forgotten a lot of it, but that's where it started. It started with those guys. It started with guys like Steve Mayer. Steve is probably, I don't hear his name enough. Let's say it that way. I remember him talking to me about the 2600, that he had a large hand in that machine, which is, begat everything else. And, if you think about that, it's just a small, simple idea. Somebody germinates and it created this industry that we all enjoyed or benefited from. And it's nice to see that, people today still appreciate it, are still buying books on it, are still, I guess there's a revitalization of putting out software that'll work on maybe on a Mac, I'm not sure, but they're bringing the games back as simple as they were. I see a lot of guys on the forums that are, buying up old systems and putting them all back together and making it work and enjoying the heck out of it, which is fascinating to me. It's like, I don't know that I'd want to go back and visit some of those games and look at them. I mean, they were frustrating then to play. But yeah, it's great that there's people. And Strong Museum is amazing. They have an amazing collection that you'll never get to see, or you might get to see in parts. The guy was nice enough to let me go backstage and see the backstage, and I got to tell you, it's mind-boggling. I strongly urge people to go there and check it out. Just go once. It'll blow your mind. It's just like, wow, this is just like kind of being back in the day. I mean, I saw, I believe I posted pictures. There's pictures of programmers' notes, literally graph paper showing, okay, here's where I need to turn on a pixel to make this character happen. But yeah, thank you. I mean, even for what you do, it's like you're a big part of keeping this ball rolling and putting out great information. Like I said, you turned me on to Greg Squires again, which is like, wow, I haven't heard that name in 40 years. It's important that, you guys are doing this stuff, because it really helps me put some of that puzzle back together. And if I can contribute and give it to you guys to push forward when I'm gone, it'd be awesome.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute something, please consider supporting my Patreon at patreon.com/Savitz. I've been publishing interviews like these since 2013 and would like to continue doing so for a long time, and your financial support will help. Thanks.